I escaped the cult I was born into, now I'm hiding because they want me back. I was standing in the apartment hallway with my key already halfway into the lock when I realized the light inside my unit was on. I hadn't left it on. I never did. I had learned early that routines were a form of safety, and turning off the light at the door was one of mine. Thumb to switch. Click. Every time. Even when I was tired. Even when I was late. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. The kind of smell that never really leaves a building, no matter how often it's cleaned. The overhead lights buzzed softly, one of them flickering just enough to register in my peripheral vision. Somewhere above me, water moved through pipes. Someone coughed behind a closed door down the hall. My hand stayed frozen in midair. The key scraped lightly against the lock as my grip loosened without my permission. The line of light under the door was thin but steady. Yellow. Not the bluish glow of a TV. Not shifting. Not blinking. Just on. I leaned forward slightly, my shoulder brushing the wall. The paint felt cool through my jacket. I tilted my head, listening for something that would explain it. Music, footsteps, a voice, anything. There was nothing. My phone vibrated in my back pocket. The sudden pressure made my stomach drop, a reflex I hadn't fully unlearned. I flinched, my fingers releasing the key. It hit the carpet with a soft, final sound that seemed too loud in the quiet hall. I didn't bend to pick it up right away. I watched the light instead, the way it formed a perfect straight line across the floor, stopping just short of my shoes. For a moment, just a moment, I thought about how close someone would have to be to the door to hear me breathing. When I finally crouched to retrieve the key, I noticed the blue strip of painter's tape along the inside of the frame. It had been peeled back and pressed down again. Crooked. I knew instantly I hadn't done that. People imagine escape as an event. A single night, a slammed door, a car disappearing down a highway. That isn't what it was for me. I didn't escape something I joined as an adult. I didn't wander into it during a vulnerable phase and then wake up one day with clarity. I was born inside it. Some of my earliest memories are structured around compliance. Sitting cross-legged on industrial carpet that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and damp fabric. The carpet always looked clean but never felt that way. Watching adults sit in folding chairs arranged in precise rows, their hands folded in their laps, their faces calm in a way that felt deliberate. No one raised their voice. That was important. Anger was considered primitive. Loss of control. The group didn't call itself a cult. It didn't even call itself a religion. It called itself a framework. Sometimes a system. Sometimes a model. Later, when regulations tightened, it called itself a behavioral optimization and reintegration network. The language was careful, clinical, neutral, words that sounded like something you might hear in a hospital or a university. My parents joined before I was old enough to speak in full sentences. By the time I was old enough to ask questions, the answers had already been rehearsed. We lived in communal housing, clusters of homes scattered across ordinary neighborhoods. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. Lawns trimmed, cars in the driveway, kids riding bikes. Inside, everything was governed. Doors were rarely locked. Privacy was considered a developmental weakness. Bedrooms were sparsely furnished. No posters. No mirrors unless approved. Journals were mandatory. They weren't diaries. They were called processing logs. Every morning began the same way. Wake at 5:30. Make the bed tightly enough that a coin could bounce. Silence until first assembly. If you spoke, you wrote down why. Assemblies were long. Adults sat in chairs. Children sat on the floor. The facilitator stood at the front, sometimes with a clipboard, sometimes with nothing at all. He spoke slowly, calmly, as if every word had been measured beforehand. He talked about alignment, about clarity, about how the self was unreliable and needed correction, about how intuition was dangerous unless properly trained. Sometimes someone was asked to stand. Sometimes it was a child. They would be asked to read from their processing log, usually the part where they admitted something. Anger, curiosity, resentment, fear. When their voice shook, the facilitator would raise one finger, not to stop them, but to signal the room to pay attention. Then he would thank them for their honesty. Then he would ask the group what patterns they noticed. It was never framed as punishment. It was framed as collective learning. Correction was love. Exposure was healing. Discomfort was growth. We learned early that crying delayed progress. As I got older, the system became more sophisticated. What had once been spiritual language slowly merged with psychology and pseudo-medicine. Facilitators began introducing charts, diagrams, terms like maladaptive cognition and attachment distortion. They told us we were participating in something cutting edge. That traditional therapy was flawed because it centered the individual instead of the system. That medication masked symptoms instead of correcting root behaviors. They didn't forbid doctors. They encouraged the right ones. Practitioners who understood the framework. Professionals who attended closed-door trainings and used the group's terminology. Food was regulated during what were called clarity cycles. Meals became smaller, plainer. Calories were discussed as stimulus. Hunger was reframed as informational. Sleep was controlled. Lights out at a fixed time. Wake-ups during the night for exercises that weren't called drills. We would be told to pack a bag in silence. To stand still while an adult calmly listed our deficiencies, reading from notes taken over months. No yelling, no insults, just data. There were rooms we weren't allowed to enter alone. There were punishments that didn't leave marks but lived in the body. Isolation was the most common. Not confinement, just removal. When you were isolated, people spoke about you as if you weren't there. They stepped around you. They didn't respond when you asked questions. It could last days. Children learned quickly that being seen was conditional. The worst practices were procedural. Once, when I was 17, I was instructed to sit in a windowless room with a notebook and write continuously. Every time my pen stopped, there was a knock at the door. Soft, polite, controlled. Resistance delays alignment, a voice would say. My hand cramped. My fingers went numb. The paper smelled warm and slightly chemical beneath my palm. I don't remember what I wrote. I remember the sound of the pen. We were taught that the outside world was chaotic, addicted to comfort, emotionally primitive. We were shown case studies of people who left without permission, their lives framed as cautionary tales. Job instability, addiction, broken relationships. We were told that leaving without proper reintegration often resulted in psychological collapse. I believed that. When I eventually left, it wasn't rebellion. It was exhaustion. Leaving didn't mean freedom. It meant exposure. I moved into adult group housing. Different building, same system, new terminology, same control. My ID was held for safekeeping. My mail was screened to prevent destabilizing contact. My phone access was restricted during reset periods. If I questioned it, I was told my discomfort indicated unresolved ego resistance. The group kept records, extensive ones, psychological profiles, behavioral timelines, family histories, trigger phrases, compliance markers. They knew which memories made you freeze, which words made you agree, which threats didn't need to be spoken aloud. That's what made leaving dangerous. I didn't announce it. I didn't argue. I waited for a morning when supervision was minimal. I packed quietly. I left my processing logs behind on purpose. No one stopped me. That silence stayed with me longer than anything else. The first weeks outside felt unreal. No schedule, no permissions, no one monitoring my posture, my tone, my intake. I sublet a room across town. Old furniture, thin walls. The smell of coffee and laundry detergent clung to everything. I liked that. It didn't mean anything. I kept the lights on at night. I bought a prepaid phone. I didn't use my legal name on delivery apps. I told myself I was just being careful. The first signs that something followed me were administrative. A form filled out with my childhood middle initial, one I hadn't used in years. A medical office calling to confirm an appointment I hadn't made, listing an address from the communal house as secondary contact. An old acquaintance from the group liking a photo I hadn't posted publicly. I told myself it was coincidence. Then there were reminders. A note on my windshield. Plain white paper, 3 words. We see you. I stood in the parking lot holding it while people walked past me, talking, laughing, living. The world didn't react. I drove straight to the police station. The officer listened politely, asked if I had suspects. I said no. I didn't mention the group. I didn't yet have the language. He logged it, gave me a report number, said it was probably a prank. I slept with my shoes on that night. Things escalated slowly. Emails with blank bodies. Missed calls with no voicemail. Packages with no return address. One contained a book I had been required to read at 16. Same edition. Same underlining. My handwriting. That was when I started documenting everything seriously. Screenshots, dates, times, printouts, a folder labeled with the date I left. Police reports began using words like pattern and nonspecific harassment. They suggested changing routines. I changed cities instead. The apartment with the hallway was supposed to be the reset. New city, new job, new lease, key fob access, cameras in the lobby. I taped the doorframe out of habit. For weeks, nothing happened. Then the light was on. Maintenance found no forced entry. Management shrugged, except the tape was crooked. After that, it escalated faster. A notebook appeared on my kitchen counter. Same brand, same chemical smell, blank except for a date. My birthday. Another arrived a week later. You don't get to leave unfinished. I sealed them in plastic, added them to the folder. I filed a harassment report. Sat across from Detective Cora Alvarez. Calm questions. Notes taken. Do you believe these individuals are attempting to reassert control? She asked. Yes, I said. She opened a case file. The worst moment wasn't violent. It was intimate. An email arrived at work from an internal address. No subject, just a PDF. IT opened it. Inside were scanned pages from my childhood processing logs. Confessions, fears, doubts. At the bottom was a phrase I recognized instantly. Alignment requires return. That's when disbelief ended. They didn't need to follow me physically. They already had me mapped. The final confirmation didn't come at night. It came on a Tuesday morning at a copy shop. I was making duplicates of my documentation when I noticed a page I hadn't brought in. Same paper, same margins, personal alignment summary, my full legal name, behavioral strengths, resistance markers, correction responsiveness, flight history, dated 3 weeks earlier. I went to the police station. Detective Alvarez didn't offer coffee. The formatting matches state-submitted documentation. she said. She slid a licensing form across the table. Behavioral reintegration program. Subject: my name. Filed 6 months after I left. Filed again 3 weeks ago. Approved. They listed you as voluntary, she said. Signed consent. The signature was mine, lifted from an intake form I signed at 16. They never needed to find you, she said quietly. They only needed to keep you active on paper. I moved again. Different state. No forwarding address. Months later, a letter arrived at a P.O. box I'd used once. A discharge summary. Status: inactive, subject unavailable. At the bottom, alignment deferred. Nothing followed after that. No notes. No emails. No lights turned on. I don't know if I was released or simply marked unreachable. After the discharge summary arrived, I tried to convince myself that the silence meant something good. I told myself it meant I had finally crossed some invisible threshold. That whatever administrative loop I'd been caught in had closed. That the phrase inactive, subject unavailable meant what it sounded like. But silence, when you're raised inside a system like that, doesn't feel like relief. It feels like waiting. I didn't sleep much that first week. I kept the letter folded on the kitchen table, face down, weighted by a glass so it wouldn't curl. I didn't want to throw it away. I didn't want to keep it. I just wanted it where I could see it if I needed to. I returned to routine the way I'd been trained to. Wake at the same time, eat the same breakfast, leave at the same hour, come back before dark. Structure was familiar. Structure felt safe, even when I knew where that instinct came from. That was the most unsettling part of escape, realizing how much of the system still lived inside me, long after I had physically left it. There were things I did without thinking. Sitting with my back straight, keeping my voice even, avoiding emotional language when speaking to authority figures, offering documentation before being asked. I hadn't been taught how to survive chaos. I'd been taught how to survive evaluation. The first new incident happened somewhere so mundane that I almost laughed when it registered. I was at a walk-in clinic. Nothing dramatic. A lingering cough. Seasonal. I hadn't slept well in months, and my body was finally starting to show it. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. A television mounted in the corner played a morning show with the sound turned low. I filled out the intake form carefully. Name, date of birth, address. When the nurse called me back, she glanced at the clipboard and hesitated. Do you still have a behavioral support provider? She asked. The question landed wrong. I stopped walking, just for a second. I don't, I said. Why? She flipped the page, scanning something I couldn't see. It's listed here, she said, not suspiciously. Casually, under external notes. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Not panic, exactly. Recognition. What's listed? I asked. She read it out loud, mispronouncing the name slightly. The organization's name. The same benign, professional name they used when dealing with schools, courts, and healthcare systems. I've never authorized that, I said. She nodded, unfazed. Happens more than you'd think, she said. I can remove it. She clicked something on the computer and kept walking. I followed her down the hall, my feet heavy, my breathing controlled. They hadn't contacted me. They hadn't followed me. They had simply never stopped inserting themselves into the background systems that defined me. That night, I pulled out the folder again. I spread everything across the kitchen table. Police reports, emails, notes, copies of logs, the discharge summary. I noticed something I hadn't before. Dates, the timing of the notes, the emails, the administrative filings, they aligned with moments of transition. Moves, new jobs, new doctors. It wasn't random. They weren't watching me in real time. They were reacting to changes in my status. Every time I stepped into a new system, they reached in ahead of me and left fingerprints. Growing up, they taught us that the body was a system to be trained. Pain was information. Hunger was feedback. Fear was resistance. Medical language crept in gradually. Facilitators attended conferences. They returned with new terminology, new binders. We began undergoing assessments, questionnaires that looked like personality inventories, stress tests, reaction timing exercises, sleep tracking, food logs. The results were never shared with us directly. They were discussed in meetings we weren't allowed to attend. Sometimes, after an assessment, you were isolated, sometimes praised, sometimes placed under increased observation. No one ever explained why. We were told explanation interfered with progress. Once, when I was 15, a facilitator sat across from me with a printed chart. He didn't let me see it. He just referenced it. Your tolerance for ambiguity is low, he said calmly. That makes you a flight risk. I didn't know what that meant yet. I learned. There were people who tried to leave before I did. Some came back. When they returned, they were quieter, slower, they spoke less, their logs were longer, they were framed as success stories. Reintegration complete, facilitators would say, but I noticed how they flinched when someone stood too close, how they waited for permission that never came. I noticed how their eyes tracked exits. No one talked about what happened while they were gone. The next escalation came through my workplace. HR emailed me one afternoon asking me to stop by their office. The tone was neutral, professional. I brought my folder. The HR representative, a woman named Iris Kenton, smiled politely and closed the door behind me. We received an inquiry, she said. A request for verification. From who? I asked. She hesitated. An external behavioral consultancy, she said. They claim to have an existing file on you. My hands rested flat on my thighs. Still, they said what kind of file? I asked. She scrolled through her email. Risk assessment history, she said. Adjustment recommendations. I nodded slowly. I didn't authorize that, I said. She nodded back. We didn't share anything, she said quickly, but we wanted to make you aware. I thanked her. I stood. I left. In the elevator, I stared at my reflection in the metal wall. The doors closed too slowly. They hadn't shown up at my door. They hadn't needed to. That was when Detective Alvarez told me something she hadn't said before. There's a reason groups like this don't chase, she said. It creates liability. We were sitting in the same interview room, same table, same chairs. They embed, she continued. They file, they classify, they let institutions do the rest. I asked her why no one shut them down. She sighed. Because nothing they submit is illegal on its own, she said. It's all framed as support, monitoring, care. I asked her what would happen if I disappeared completely. She didn't answer right away. Then the file would eventually close, she said. Or go dormant. That word again, dormant. I thought about disappearing, really disappearing. No job, no lease, no doctors, no systems. I realized how impossible that was. I realized how thoroughly I had been trained to exist inside systems, and how deeply they understood that dependency. The most disturbing realization came later, quietly. I was reviewing one of the copied logs late one night, reading words I barely remembered writing. I found a page near the back, a section labeled consent parameters. I didn't remember this part. It listed conditions under which external intervention was authorized. Medical, psychological, administrative. The language was broad, flexible. At the bottom was a signature. Mine. I was 14. My parents' signatures were beneath it. I sat at the table for a long time, my fingers resting on the page, the paper thin and dry under my skin. They hadn't forged consent. They had trained me to give it. After that, the fear changed shape. It wasn't about being followed anymore. It was about being defined. As long as a version of me existed on paper, assessed, classified, tracked, they didn't need my body. They only needed my name. The last confirmation came months later, when I wasn't expecting anything at all. I was applying for a professional license. Routine. Online. One of the questions asked if I had ever participated in a behavioral intervention program. I hesitated. I clicked no. The system rejected the form. A message appeared, inconsistent with external records. I stared at the screen. They were still there, not watching, waiting. I called the licensing board, spoke to a representative named Malik Shorn. He was patient, apologetic. There's a notation in your file, he said, from a registered provider. What kind of notation? I asked. Participation history, he said. It's flagged for verification purposes. I never authorized that, I said. You might have, he said gently. When you were younger, these things stay in the system. I asked how to remove it. He was quiet for a moment. You'd need documentation proving the entry was made in error, he said, or consent withdrawal filed through the original provider. I hung up. I stared at the wall for a long time. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. I don't know if the file will ever be fully erased. I don't know if someone still updates it. What I know is this. The light hasn't turned on again. The tape hasn't moved. No one has contacted me directly. And that might be the most frightening outcome of all, because it means the system worked exactly as designed. Quietly, efficiently, without needing to touch me ever again. I've learned to live with the records, with the knowledge that somewhere, in databases I'll never see, a version of me exists. Assessed, categorized, marked. I lock the door every night. I turn off the light. I check the tape. These rituals feel different now. They're not compliance anymore. They're choice. I started therapy 6 months ago. A real therapist. One who had never heard of the group. One who listened when I explained what processing logs were. What alignment meant. What it felt like to grow up inside a system that called control care. She didn't tell me I was broken. She told me I was adapting. I've kept the folder. All of it. Police reports. Emails. The discharge summary. The consent form I signed at 14. Sometimes I open it. Sometimes I don't. On good days, it's just paper. On harder days, it's proof. I still check my medical records periodically. I flag anything that looks unfamiliar. I've learned to ask questions, to request documentation, to assert boundaries in places where I was trained not to have them. It's exhausting. It's also necessary. Last week, I received a letter, not from them, from the state licensing board. The notation had been removed. Malik Shorn had flagged it as outdated, submitted a correction request, pushed it through. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hands, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the folder, not as proof of victory, as proof of progress. I still walk past that apartment sometimes. Different tenant now, different schedule. The hallway still smells the same. I don't stop. I don't look up at the door, but I notice when the overhead light flickers. I notice when someone stands too close. I notice, and I keep walking, because healing isn't forgetting. It's not even freedom, not entirely. Sometimes it's just learning how to exist in a world that keeps records, and choosing, every single day, to keep going anyway. I lock the door, I turn off the light, I walk forward, and some nights, that has to be enough.